Millions of school children missing lessons will cause a surge in violent crime, according to an analysis by the Centre for Social Justice. The failure to get children back into school to pre-pandemic levels will see a tidal wave of youth crime. Last year, the number of persistently absent pupils rose from 800,000 to 1.7 million. That's more than doubling. These pupils have been called ghost children, who have disappeared from the system following the pandemic. This matters because the research predicts these pupils are 3 times more likely to commit serious offences, with lifelong consequences for them and for society. Though the government has introduced provisions to help students catch up on lost learning during the pandemic, these resources only help children who are in the system, but the ghost children have disappeared. So joining me now to discuss this is Deputy Director of the Centre for Social Justice, Jacob Prestidge. Jessica, thank you so much for coming in. This is really important. So 900,000 more children are now out of the system than before. Of the 800,000 previously, what were they doing? Why were they not in the system?
As in the...
before the pandemic, there were 800,000. Were they mainly homeschooled? Were they mainly playing truant? What is the scale of the increase in the problem?
I would say we don't have a very detailed breakdown of the reasons for persistent absence pre-pandemic, but I think it is probably fair to say that the kind of nature of absence was more consistent pre-pandemic. And with this kind of very significant spike that we've seen, with persistent absence rising to 1.7 million, as you say, there's a huge amount of diversity within that figure. So we as the CSJ have spent a lot of time talking to parents and small charities and schools to try and get to the bottom of what's driving this increase. And what's become really obvious is that there's not any kind of one-size-fits-all prescription here because the reasons are so varied. We are very consistently hearing that mental health is a problem, with anxiety coming up in particular. I would also probably point to a slight kind of erosion in attitudes towards the necessity of school among parents. And I think that's largely a product of lockdown and school closures. Children were obviously all sent home and suddenly school became kind of less necessary.
So if you say to parents, you don't need to send your child to school for the best part of 2 years.
Exactly.
They then think when that period's up, well, why were we bothering? Why are we getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning to get our children to school when they didn't need to go before?
Exactly, and I would say that kind of the series of strikes that we've seen as well that have led to a number of school closures haven't helped with that either.
And then anxiety. Is anxiety the reality, or is it also partly an excuse parents use when they get found out that their children aren't coming into school? Instead of getting fined for not sending their children in, they say, oh, my child's got anxiety.
I mean, I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I think it is obvious that in a lot of cases parents are struggling too, so a blame game probably isn't particularly productive here, which is why we're recommending the national rollout of attendance mentors. The idea being that these are specialist key workers who work with families to get under the skin of what's driving persistent absence, and then they're able to kind of prescribe remedies on a case-by-case basis. And in some cases, that might be very, very kind of softly. In others, it might require a kind of firmer hand.
And how would the mentors work? Would they be attached to individual schools? Would they be existing teachers within schools given a further responsibility? And where would the resources come from?
So they absolutely wouldn't be teachers given additional responsibility. I think we are very sympathetic to the fact that teachers their workload is sufficient and we don't want to add to that. So the idea with attendance mentors is that they would be attached to the local authority and then they would work with particular schools within that remit. And
how does the local authority know who isn't attending? Because you don't have to tell the local authority that you're not attending, do you?
So it would really be kind of a relational response. So it would be based on the relationships that attendance mentors develop with schools in their area.
And to go back to the earlier times, was 800,000 a reasonable number not to be attending, or was that still too high? Is there a target level that is a sort of acceptable level of non-attendance?
I mean, to my mind, any level of non-attendance is too high.
Other than homeschooling, obviously, because then...
Yes, this is absolutely not about homeschooling. This is a very separate issue. We're talking about children that should be at school and they're not attending school as much as they should be, whether they're severely absent, which means they're missing 50% of their school time, or they're persistently absent, which means they're missing 10% of their school time. This is not about kids that are receiving their education via other means.
And the increase in violent crime concern, how is that estimated? Where does that come from? How big a worry is that?
So basically what we did was analyse published government data which looks at the educational characteristics of young offenders. And from that data, we were able to kind of establish the risk factor associated with persistent absence. And then what we did was apply that risk factor to two potential future scenarios. In scenario one, persistent absence rates return to their pre-pandemic level. And in scenario two, persistent absence rates remain elevated at their current level. And the difference between those two numbers is the 9,000 potential additional young offenders that we're talking about, which sounds a little bit opaque, I appreciate, but the kind of key fact here is that persistently absent pupils are around 3 times more likely to go on to commit an offence. So it's clearly a very significant risk factor that government needs to have in mind.
And is a very high cost, because people who go on to be persistent offenders then meet the criminal justice system, then end up in prison, and therefore the mentors could be actually aware in the long term, not only, most importantly, of giving children a second chance, but also would pay for themselves because of the savings you would get through avoiding these criminal justice costs.
Yes, exactly. So we've kind of estimated that the cost of this increase in youth offending would be around 100 million. And the cost of a national rollout of attendance mentors would be about 80 million. And we're proposing that that is paid for from the National Tutoring Programme underspend. Because, as you say, the National Tutoring Programme is a great initiative. Providing resources to help kids catch up is really important, but they can't catch up if they're not in school in the first place. So we think getting children back into the classroom is kind of absolutely fundamental to helping them catch up.
So you've come up with a scheme that actually is self-funding in the long term, but also in the shorter term, because there's the underspend on the tutoring programme, and therefore the resources are available for this within the system, that you'd be moving it from the schools to the local authorities. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, we're talking about underspend, so this isn't money that schools are using, this is money that's being returned to the Treasury. We're not talking about withdrawing resource from schools. But yes, the attendance mentors would sit with the local authority.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, for coming in.